To understand Sevika's loyalty is to understand Zaun's inequality. Life as a Zaunite is anything but fair or easy. Zaun is a deprived Undercity, and its people bear the wrath of its opposing, profiteering city, Piltover. Arcane starts as a series depicting an oppressive state dictating the livelihoods of others who were unfortunate enough to be born on the wrong side of a bridge. The tension between Piltover and Zaun is not a conflict. Conflict suggests equal footing, and even to the bitter end, Zaun comes out belittled by the oppressors they help, with only a small sign of change and no solidified resolution. The common enemy trope held no real promise of a solution. Arcane's centrist ending and abandonment of its political story shows little impact to a narrative that constantly displayed Piltover as a persistent, active oppressor. Piltover had legislative power over Zaun. The government responsible for both cities contained only Piltovans, with an exception of one wealthy Noxian, and no Zaunites in sight. The councillors bore classist decision-making over an entire city who had no say in the matter. Zaunites were purposefully given no voice, and yet the screams caused by death, wailing from the enforcers' brutality, and battle cries of uprising fell on deaf ears. So before I dive into why Sevika was headstrong in her desire for Piltover's downfall and the freedom of her people, let me paint you a picture of what Zaunites went through all this time. Zaunites are victims of chemical warfare. Caitlyn, Vi and other enforcers use the Grey as a weapon to harm and capture the Chembarons running amok. While specifically targeted, the Grey is still gas. The likelihood of it spreading to innocents isn't zero. Through Victor alone, we know the consequences of long-term exposure. Shortened exposure, however, deals with milder results as seen through Silco's usage. Yet length of time is still null to the fact that it was still used by Caitlyn, whose tunnel vision of succumbed rage and vengeance believed the Chembarons were explicitly the targets and sufferers. But even so, whilst the Chembarons were criminals, they only behaved as such due to a life of inhumane discrimination under an oppressive regime. No person, even the Chembarons, deserved the unethical treatment of chemical warfare. Zaunites are at a greater risk of acquiring a disability. Many cast members, most notably Victor, Silco, Vi, Isha, Jinx, Sevika, Caitlyn, Jace and Sallow, have physical or mental disabilities. However, there's a clear distinction in the cause of disabilities between Zaun and Piltover citizens. The disabled Zaunites mentioned are victims of poverty, classism, discrimination, poisoning and trauma, all inflicted by Piltover, who played into the cause of Zaunites' disabilities. And if not directly from Piltover, was from infighting within Zaun that was a product of Piltover's ruling, splitting Zaunites apart anyhow. Most times their disabilities are a consequence of oppression. This differs from topsiders. Minus Sallow, neither Caitlyn nor Jace became severely injured and thus disabled at the hands of Zaunites. On the other hand, thousands in Zaun dealt with the consequences of Piltover's actions or inactions, leading to a population having a high rate of acquired disability. Zaunites are wrongfully arrested. Enforcers invoke violence from Zaunites, belittle and tease them into standing up for themselves as an excuse for cruelty and a showcase of power. To the freedom fighters they don't kill, they arrest, offering no displeasure in sending off Zaunites to Stillwater despite their innocence. Stillwater is a prison system unconcerned with human rights and shows further brutality in a network that oh so conveniently never affects topsiders.
Not cooperative, huh? You want us to have a chat with her?
Zaunites are not given proper burials. From Victor pouring Sky's ashes into the Undercity waters, Zaunite rebels left dead on the bridge, Vi and Powder's parents remembered through a broken pillar, Vanda's body used and abused several times before being exploded, to Silco's body becoming one with the plagued river. Zaunites receive no fancy nor grand funerals. There are no caskets in respect or delicately expensive sculpted pieces to remember them by, unlike Pilties. Their bodies are left to rot, their murderers, corrupt blood-hungry cops, often the cause, because Zaunites are constantly invaded.
Then it's settled. 2-1. We invade.
Whilst Mel and Shula were more diplomatic than the other councillors, seeking a non-violent resolution, invasion was still the plan when it should never have been an option.
But I draw the line at Hextech. We have an ethos. Such force must be a final resort.
Agreed.
Instead, whilst they sat in Piltover, covered head to toe in expensive jewellery and clothing, ignorant to the pain of Zaunites, they encouraged enforcers, gave them the order to invade their homes. Whilst with better intentions, Mel's own ignorance to the enforcers' brutality, even without Hextech, was also instrumental in leading to more deaths and violence. Though I'll admit her decision-making is understandable given her mother and past experiences. But enforcer brutality and the death caused is a familiar scene to Zaunites. Innocent children are welcomed by death at an early age and visited continuously. The scars of trauma are all ones Zaunites have to endure. And yet despite that, many carry kind hearts when bitterness would be completely justifiable. Compared to how Caitlin and Jace deal with death much further into their adult lives, do you see how sheltered Topsiders are, privileged to have lived so long without experiencing such already? Jace is incapable of handling the sight of dead bodies. Caitlin ran a deadly revenge path over her mother's death and other traumatic events, and whilst further incited and manipulated by Ambessa, were still her actions to be accounted for. By her age, Zaunites had seen more dead bodies than they could count on both hands. Zaunites lived in a city where fighting for survival was inevitable, because the greed of Piltover and corruption of their ways led to desperate measures in the Undercity. The unchecked enforcers, enabled by the Council, are to blame for most of this. Discriminative actions and words are par for the course of Piltover's police workforce and unjust repertoire. Cruelty, mockery, classism, and pure brutality are but a few responses they enact on Zaunites that exhibit their unlawful behaviour.
You people down here are all the same. Mistaking arrogance for bravery. You think you're standing up for something? But we all know there is a crime behind every coin that passes through this place.
Marcus embodies the true nature of enforcers. His classist ego mistaking innocent bystanders fighting for food and basic human rights as criminals. His own prejudices called for all of Zaun to be detained, especially those willing to fight against a regime that exploits them. Which is funny, considering he's a corrupt cop who accepts blood money from a Zaunite kingpin himself, but a hungry child hunting for food is where morality gets muddled for him. Hell, the only reason Hextech crystals are found by Powder is due to fully prepared and fancy sandwiches left in Jace's quarters. Most Zaunites are starving and wouldn't even leave a crumb in the presence of such high quality food. Amazing how Powder devouring a mere sandwich shows a better depiction of poverty and class than the show's finale did. But Marcus's statement not only reflected on his morality towards law-breaking, but showed his classist viewpoint of poorer means dumber. Yes, poverty can affect the amount of resources available to help learn and teach, but it is not a determinator of intelligence.
The form is crude, but the engineering is inspired.
Many in Zaun are intelligent. Victor, Jinx and Echo are great inventors, technicians and scientists. These three developed many of the gadgets and moral viewpoints shown in the series. Whilst characters like Vi and Sevika are quick on their feet, they're both adaptable, intuitive and have good instincts, skills often overlooked compared to what is normally associated with intellect. And that's another reason Topsiders snide at Zaunites when called out, as they believe them to be lower in all aspects due to their superiority mindset. To understand Sevika's loyalty is to understand Piltover's prejudice, ignorance, negligence and unaccountability towards Zaun, the four pillars of Piltover's oppression.
This is Vi. She's from the Undercity. So I see.
Besides the councillors, most Piltovans live a life naive to the truth, being that their leaders are coercive in the exploitation and subjugation of their neighbouring city, leading to an intolerant mindset against Zaun. Even the supposed good Piltovans in the show, Jace and Caitlin, exemplify prejudice towards Zaunites. A life sheltered, ridden with implicit bias and fed stereotypes of trenches, will inevitably hold discriminative beliefs towards a city deemed lesser than them. For instance, Caitlin's prejudice dumbfounds her when called out.
In what mad world would I trust someone like you?
Someone like me? You enforcers are all the same.
Your people hunt us. Like animals. Silco pays them to do it.
And whilst intense emotions, especially mourning a loved one, can impair rational thinking and genuine thoughts, Her original prejudice returned even after building relationships with Zaunites with the same phrasing.
A memorial? What kind of animals?
Jace is an offender of discriminative language too.
I told you I knew someone.
Well, you didn't say they were from the Undercity.
What difference does that make?
They're dangerous.
Notice how both Jace and Caitlin use similar language regarding Zaunites? Labeling them as animals and dangerous perpetuates the stigma towards those in poverty, and that they're wild things to be tamed. That descriptive language radicalizes and dehumanizes a city of people who are victims of the troubles Piltover's people cause. They unknowingly disregard Zaun's structural problems, despite befriending and loving Zaunites themselves, who have shared their experiences with oppression, which makes their comments even worse. Though Jace does instantly apologise. What's more ironic is that Caitlin calls Rennie an animal, unaware that the Kembaran attacked the memorial only to avenge her murdered son. An obvious example of pot kettle black, I must say. Ignorance is another teeth-grinding Piltovan characteristic aimed towards Zaunites.
What is this place? It's where the kind of people you topsiders don't want to think about wind up.
What, you don't have parents?
No. They were killed by enforcers.
In Season 1, Caitlyn's ignorance, formed by a luxurious upbringing, is intentionally thrown in her face the second she visits the Undercity. She first-handedly comes to grasp the Council's lack of involvement and wishes to help. I do genuinely believe this to be Caitlyn's true character, as some moments in Season 2 also reflect that side of Caitlyn. But those moments become lost in her misplaced tyrannical ruling. Her issues were with Jinx, and Jinx alone, but that grieving narrow-mindedness blinded her from the incredible harm all of Zaun suffered by her hand. The show often reveals Jace's ignorance too. One thing he brings up throughout the show is the fissures.
The Atlas Gauntlets. The mining colonies in the fissures can work faster and without fatigue.
I do believe Jace only wants to do right by people, and his work towards the Gauntlets was an invention to help Zaunites. Only issue being, whilst the Gauntlets would prove helpful for laborious work, that doesn't solve the working conditions themselves. Those miners would rather have better air quality than gloves that can make them work harder and quicker. Through Silco, who was a miner, we know how poisonous the gases were down there. It was the air killing them. The same air that affected his partner Victor his entire childhood. Jace even visited Zaun in Season 1 off-screen visiting Benzo's store. So he should have known the streets don't have access to normal air conditions.
Instead of it exploding in your neighborhood, it would blow up in ours.
We're miles from the main fissures.
These are the same utility ducts that carry our water and facilitate our ventilation.
But this also checks out given he was an ignorant person who valued Enforcers' lives over Zaunites, who were justifiably rebelling against Piltover.
Enforcers fear to set foot in the lanes.
A pretty obtuse thing to say when there are children fearing for their lives because the Enforcers are brutal towards anyone, no matter their age. Which leads me to Piltover's negligence of Zaun. Despite the warranted accusations I've made against Jace and Caitlyn, these two were the only prominent Piltovans willing to make changes for Zaun, after listening to and seeing their problems. Caitlyn confronts the Council, hoping to tell the truth and being helpful.
What does the Silco even want from us?
He believes the Undercity should be independent. He calls it the Nation of Zaun.
Only for the councillors to scoff and mock the idea of Zaun wanting independence, despite doing nothing for them. They show a negligence in wanting to even listen to the Undercity at all. And when Jace does go through with that deal, their initial reaction is anger, tantrums and disbelief.
Jace has brokered a peace with Silco in exchange for the Undercity's independence.
What?
It makes sense for Jace's mind to have changed, what with an ill Victor by his side, and Vi rightfully calling him out on the Councillor's disregard for Zaunites.
One dead kid? There's hundreds more where he came from, thanks to Silco and thanks to people like you who stuck their heads in the dirt.
Vi calls out their complacency, and why wouldn't she? Vi saw her parents' murdered bodies on a bridge, watched Vanda and her brothers die, went through a childhood of being hunted by enforcers, and suffered wrongful imprisonment. All of that resulted from the Council's negligence.
I grew up knowing I'm less than them. That my place is down there.
But also their unaccountability. The councillors can play ignorance all they wish, but they're part of a system that should cater to all their people, Piltovans and Zaunites alike. It was their job as political leaders to determine the safety, budgeting and decision-making of Zaun's well-being. Cassandra's own daughter had to call out their mistreatments, and how they've eluded any blame or consequences as they failed to realise it themselves.
You know what else reflects on the council? It's citizens living on the streets, being poisoned, having to choose between a kingpin who wants to exploit them and a government that doesn't give a shit.
Jace even goes as far as killing an innocent young boy with no prosecution or conviction. Was it on purpose? Absolutely not. And you see the guilt in his eyes straight away. But it was manslaughter, or boyslaughter, more appropriately. He doesn't even get a slap on the wrist, because him barging into Zaun with weapons and enforcers, arresting innocent kids and a way of stopping shimmer distribution was but the norm. It's never mentioned again besides Rennie exacting revenge for her son, and he never explains to anyone why she did so. I love Jace, but this is one of the clearest examples of the council never being held accountable for their crimes. You could argue he's sacrificed his life for everyone, so morally, he did everyone right. But that's bar the point of never being convicted for manslaughter. And yet, at the start of the show, they put him on trial for possessing unstable crystals, proving being a counsellor gives you even more of a shield against blame. But you know what I couldn't blame Jace for doing? Wanting to learn more skills through today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare provides thousands of creative classes, all taught by industry experts. These classes cater to all skill levels, from beginners to advanced learners, and aims to make each topic accessible, no matter how challenging it may seem. Every class offers fresh opportunities for growth. Whether you're looking to start animation or motion design, likelihood is, Skillshare has classes dedicated towards it. Personally, I recommend courses from Kurzgesagt, as they break down everything you need to get started into small, easily digestible parts. Animation can be tough to learn, or even know where to start, but Skillshare makes it more manageable through learning paths. These curated collections make starting a whole new skill feel easier, as each class is broken into segments. Together, they'll help you gain a comprehensive understanding of animation, or the skill of your choosing, along with practical tips and techniques you can apply on your own. Whilst animation is just one focus of Skillshare, you could also explore other areas like knitting, music theory, dancing, and a wide range of other topics. If you're someone wanting to explore more skills or an activity as a hobby, the first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. A massive thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. With all the evidence showing Piltover's actions, it's of no surprise that the oppressed fight back, that Sevika fights back, and with such persistent intensity. Other Zaunites show resistance towards Piltover and its systemic classism in different ways, some with clearer goals of liberation and the collapse of Piltover's political force, and some whose priority falls upon their family instead. Neither are wrong, and it's interesting to see how Zaunites approach things differently. Victor fights for Zaun through his inventions, while the council vehemently opposes him, seeking to weaponize his creations against his people. Piltover repeatedly exploited him and ignored his valuable insights. Despite living in Piltover and being a pioneer that introduced Hextech, which changed Piltover to an even richer and sought city, he was overshadowed. Even Jace disregarded Victor's autonomy by allowing him to live and not destroying the Hex core. Though I do get why Jace did this, he did his best and it backfired. Vi and Vanda's political narratives parallel another to a T. Both start as Zaunites prepared to fight, angered by the abuse and mistreatment they tackle. Those who valued Vanda's integrity and his fight for Zaun on the bridge recognised him as a leader and protected him.
Bit of advice. Don't threaten the guy who pours the drinks.
Teenage Vi showed hatred towards Piltover, her distaste for them and what they symbolise, reflecting a younger Vanda.
And one day, this city's gonna respect us.
But both do inevitably work for or as their oppressors. Vanda works with Grayson in a pact of truce and protection. His leadership turns more diplomatic in wishing for issues to be resolved without people getting hurt. He saw the deaths on the bridge, saw the children orphaned by it, and was a changed man coming out. But a good enforcer is still an enforcer. and Grayson brought an onslaught of her buddies to arrest one Zaunite. Which is why Sevika calls him out, believing his resolve for Zaun to have softened during the transition to fatherhood and his additional responsibilities.
Do I look afraid?
No. You look weak.
And Vi is someone whose childhood was ripped from her. Her earlier years spent running from enforcers and simply surviving, to her teenage years to adulthood spent abused in a prison because of an enforcer. After being released from Stillwater, Powder was her one and only priority. Throughout the show after her release, you still see her distaste for Piltovers, but perhaps a larger show of hatred for Silco's betrayal to her family and his control of Shimmer distribution affecting more Zaunites. But putting on the Enforcer uniform, wearing the badge, and allowing the Grey to be let loose in the Undercity was a low for her, and to some, the final straw. Even her blaming the Zaunite boy, whom Jace had killed, was pretty distasteful, even if it was said to console Jace and get him back on track. She did show sorrow not long after, however.
You didn't have a choice. He knew what he was signing up for.
Especially considering Victor, another Zaunite, throws the idea of choice for Piltovans to be vital in their decisions that affect Zaunites' lives.
There is always a choice.
I don't think Vander nor Vi's resolve for Zaun softens, but other attributes being their family's safety becomes a higher priority.
Thanks.
Also, the writers didn't explore Vi's character enough in Season 2 to let us truly see her decision-making reasons and feelings besides the few signs of discomfort that are forgotten pretty quickly. I feel they ignored her individuality outside of Caitlyn and Jinx. That caused Vander and Vi to sacrifice their morals, experiencing some internal conflict, though this deserved more exploration, as they allied with their tormentors, or in Vi's case, becoming one of them hoping to change things from the inside. I don't agree with such actions, but I understand. Partially. Though I fully understand why other Zaunites would see this as disloyal. Jinx and Sevika in particular would never side with enforcers, even if threatened point blank. Even Silco never sided with them. He blackmailed and used them, absolutely, but never sided with them. Silco was a calculated, determined and stubborn man who prioritised his want of Zaun's freedom over actual Zaunites' lives he deemed sacrificial for his cause. He was more radical in his methods, and clearly more bitter against his oppressors, which is fair, given he was so used to the Grey as a minor he could breathe it with no issue.
You die for the cause, but you won't fight for one.
But just like Vander, he too found his priorities shift. His attachment to Jinx, who effectively became his daughter, only because he orphaned her, left his original strength and resolve for Zaun,
the sons and daughters of Zaun deserve more than their runoff.
To falter in the end.
Independence, a seat at the table, all in return for you. They can all burn.
Compared to Vander, Silco took radical actions, believing them necessary to regain control of Zaun, eliminate his oppressors, and refuse to coexist with them. Zaunites suffered at the hands of Piltover for decades. Therefore, I understand why Silco believed forceful decisions would have to have been made in seeing true change. He didn't want apathetic centrism, but total independence for Zaun. But true freedom is never given, especially not by those in power. To rephrase his own quote, violence is a base necessary for change. It's just a shame that violence also involved many innocent Zaunite lives through his drug trafficking and child slavery. The complexity of Jinx's motivation and loyalty to Zaun is significant. She's seen as a symbol and revolutionary to many, her act of rebellion against the council igniting many Zaunites' vigour and premise of uprising. Issue is, she's disinterested in the fight for Zaun, for the most part.
Silco spent his whole life trying to rally the Undercity together. Stupid joke that it is, you have the chance to pull it off.
I told you, I'm not interested.
It's arguable her apathy lies in the circumstance of losing yet another father figure, and her sister to a Pilty. We know she hates Piltovans, hates enforcers. That never changes and I'm glad it doesn't. But she never seems as protective of Zaun compared to Echo, or at least as dedicated to being a reason for change.
Firelights, your fans, anyone I can bring to the table. Stick your head in the dirt if you want.
Huh. Where did I hear that phrase before?
Thanks to Silco and thanks to people like you who stuck their heads in the dirt.
I'd pin Jinx's moral complexity down to her inaction of helping out Zaun. But like Sevika, she plays a part in damaging so many Zaunites' lives herself. She does Silco's biddings, kills many Firelights who are trying to help Zaun, and puts Echo's life in danger several times, if not just outright killing him along with herself. But she also displays symptoms of severe mental health issues. Her trauma, psychosis, and suicidal tendencies absolutely play a part in her attachment to Silco, and thus being manipulated into doing his commands, but that doesn't excuse personal accountability. What makes Jinx so interesting is that you see her allegiance to Zaun in smaller ways, like giving Zaunite kids a spectacle at the expense of Piltover, or gifting Sevika a prosthetic arm to kill Smeech. Ultimately, her allegiance grows stronger with the return of family and community. Isha shows her the innocence of Zaunite youth. Those captured in Stillwater collectively thank and support Jinx upon their breakout, and she fights alongside Zaun in the battle against Victor and Mbessa. It takes time, but her loyalty to Zaun does return. But Echo and Sevika's persistence in wanting better for Zaun in their own ways prevails most of all Zaunites. They never once falter from the path of wanting a better future for Zaunites. They both approach it differently, sure. They're different sides of the same coin. Echo is a very selfless character. He looks towards a future surrounded by laughter and a thriving community hidden from the terrors of Piltover's oppression. He remembers those lost, who showed the best of the Undercity, and allows them to shine. The Firelights fight against those, whether Zaunite or Piltovan, who make lives worse for others.
It's not enough to give people what they need to survive. You have to give them what they need to live.
But in saying this, his ideals still keep the status quo of Piltover's reign. Eventually, in time, Piltover and the Enforcers would have discovered the Firelights' hideout, no doubt ripped it for resources, evicted its people, and recycled the same abuse inflicted on the rest of Zaun. He looked to defeat Silco and abolish Shimmer, but we never learn of his views regarding Piltover's control over Zaun. While Sevika makes the harsh decisions necessary for that change, along with Silco. Again, I don't agree with all of them, but I recognise why. Piltover cannot erase its domination of her life and her people with a measly, "we'll give you a seat at the council." As viewers, we're left to presume everyone around Sevika died. Her family, her friends, both the leaders she followed, even Isha and Jinx, to her knowledge. A life like that doesn't go unscorned. She'd rather eradicate the enemies who put Zaunites through a life like hers than live alongside them. And to do that, she wants to use force, even going head to head with a robust man like Vanda to get that message across, because she always means business.
We should hit them back. We've got the numbers to beat them.
But it's not until season 2 do you see her morals change, see her no longer wanting to be a part of a revolution that segregates Zaunites, but brings them together.
We gotta choose right now whether we're gonna throw in the towel or make a stand together.
Sevika has the spirit of understanding that the cause is greater than one individual person. And she is for the people of Zaun getting their independence.
It's why Sevika and Scar abandoned Jace when he begged for help against Victor and Mbessa. Bear in mind this was their first invitation to the council room, because Jace expected those the council neglected and imprisoned to risk their lives fighting on Piltovan soil. Throughout the show, Sevika advocates for Piltover's accountability and Zaunites' self-determination. Only issue with Sevika's plan being, would the Chem Barons and criminals within Zaun, who capitalise off their own, be willing to give up their power too? If Sevika fights for Zaun's freedom, then Echo fights for a Zaun worth living in. Both of their ideals are right, and I think the combination of both would work best for Zaun. Of all Zaunites mentioned, Sevika and Echo's loyalty to Zaun persists to the end. But there's something about the unchanging resolve Sevika shows towards Zaun that made her my favourite character of the series. So, let me break down the reasons why. Sevika always looked for the most effective path in liberating Zaun. In Season 1, she deemed Silco's brains and desire for Piltover's downfall to be the correct path. She knew being soft in fighting the oppressors would achieve no real outcome, and so Silco, who will do extremities, would be sufficient for the cause in self-determination and break from class division. Makes sense, he has been a victim of Piltover's systemic control for the longest. He's a strategist and a tactician with a hatred for Piltover that has boiled over for decades. If anyone knew change required harsh necessities, it was him. Silco was the brain, but he thought of Sevika as the brawn. He constantly gave Sevika the dirty physical jobs he didn't want to do. Silco possessed drive and intellect, but Sevika enabled much of his success.
I can't believe you're dead, and I'm still mopping up your messes.
Help her with the body.
Couldn't do much himself. About now, he'd have me all over the lanes, running his collections.
Building his weapons.
Making his deals.
Sevika will clean up today's mess.
Sevika? That ogre couldn't clean a dust bunny with a blowtorch.
Despite the hiccups caused by Jinx, which were dismissed by Silco, she persisted, did what she deemed necessary for the end goal, even if the revolutionary Kingpin showed no appreciation of her efforts. And yet, in doing so, she gained his trust. And trust is power. She had Silco gasping for air and clutching his pearls, thinking she was going to betray and kill him, because he had put trust in her loyalty to him. Sevika is one of the few characters who could evoke that state in him, and lucky for him, her self-respect and morals knew a man like Finn wouldn't be fitting for the cause of Zaun.
Were you tempted?
Not for a worm like him.
And it's funny because in theory, Sevika was right to follow and be loyal to Silco, in that he was able to strike a deal with Jace that Vander never could have. He gained independence, a seat at the council table, and more. Her loyalty was so close to paying off until Silco sacrificed it all for Jinx. In spite of that, Sevika does grow into a leadership role after Silco's murder, and whilst actions speak louder than words, she does speak on the importance of community, which she grows to appreciate in Season 2.
Topside is the real enemy. Us killing each other is playing right into their hands.
As her voice actor confirms, she's someone whose loyalty is exclusively reserved for Zaun.
I think she's Team Zaun all the way, and that's what we love about Sevika. She's loyal to the end, and I think that at the end of the day, you need someone like Sevika on your side.
And it's why she refuses to give Jinx up, even if it meant Piltovans would have gone to less drastic and chemical warfare measures to get to her.
We don't hand over our people.
In saying this, a lot of her actions that prove her loyalty to Zaun are overlooked. She's a woman of perseverance. No matter how many times she's knocked down or the frequency with which she suffers her arm being damaged in what must be a traumatic cycle, she always gets up. After every beating, she finds the strength to reach Silco or Jinx. She bleeds out, or the equivalent of such, and still seeks out her associates, hoping to convey information before she blacks out or dies. Even during her fight with Caitlyn, Sevika tries to stall her off from Jinx, so much to the point the Hexgate's glitchy episode connects to her Shimmer-related scar injuries and electrocutes her tortuously. And yet she still gets up and protects Isha and Jinx with her body. A common theme in Season 2, as she comes to save Isha and Jinx earlier in the series when they encounter Smeech, with only one gun and no prosthetic arm to her name. And again when Sevika holds off a wriggling Isha with one arm, which is highly impressive, to protect her from Warwick as Jinx fights him off. She puts her words and body on the line for Zaun frequently in the show, and it's such a display of loyalty that gets overlooked. However, it'd be hypocritical to only talk about Sevika's loyalty without calling out the misdeeds she carried out too. Her lack of support at the rally stemmed from her actions. She'd harmed many Zaunites in her obedience to Silco, and held responsibility in allowing the Kimbarons to thrive through the means of exploitation. Sevika felt they were necessary choices, much like Silco, but her willingness to beat up Zaunite children to allow the demise of Vander, who she betrayed, isn't a good look. Vander was the only Zaunite to receive a statue of remembrance. Nothing polished or expensive like Piltovans receive, but one clearly made out of genuine love. Despite Sevika's betrayal to the Hound of the Underground, you see her reflect on his statue in Season 2. Unconventionally, she befriends his daughter, I'd argue even becomes softer when around Jinx and Isha. She finally recognises why Vander valued community, of all things, and has an underrated redemption arc when seeing the strength in it herself. Because Sevika's personality, along with her convictions, is what makes her so likeable. She's not only loyal to Zaun, but enjoyable to watch. She carries herself with such confidence through the Undercity, and is self-assured in who she deems worthy of her time and attention. No one dares touch her minus Vi and Jinx, and even then, the way she talked to Jinx and still lived to tell the tale is impressive in its own metric. Plus, she knew what buttons to press for both of them, making them vulnerable with a few trigger words in her attentiveness.
She's like his daughter. She's with some girl enforcer. Guess she replaced you.
Sevika gets a high from winning, whether finding people's weaknesses, having the high ground over a Pilty, or getting back at Smeech after he belittled her, and with a gambling arm no less.
Tell me, who's a funny-looking rat now?
Perhaps her exhilaration at having a sense of control stems from a life that always excluded it. At the end of the day, Sevika is just as human as any other character, and Fortiche did an incredible job of showing her vulnerability in the rare time she shows it.
Let's just say I didn't always see eye to eye with my old man.
She gets frustrated, she mourns the people she cares about, shows disgust and annoyance at others, and struggles with actions when upset. And to my surprise, had great chemistry with Jinx in Season 2.
Don't suppose you can swim, huh? Lefty?
There's something hilarious about having the straight man of the series, okay, neither of those words work with Sevika, but let's go with it, be the comedic foil to Jinx. Fitting the normally stoic character alongside the blue-haired, mentally unstable girl who blasted off her arm in the first place is perfect. It's just a shame it never continued into most of Act 2, or at all in Act 3. Which is a great transition to the next topic. Did the writers do Sevika and Zaun right in the end? Ultimately, the pacing for Season 2 suffered more than Season 1, and you can tell that from Sevika's narrative alone. A photo posted by her voice actress shows her in a recording booth, working on an Act 3 Sevika scene, so unless she only breathed into the microphone, the final edit removed her lines. Her involvement in Act 3 was absent save for a few scenes, considering the caption of her character poster was, "Armed and ready, Sevika's story continues in the final act of Arcane," with a promise of more. The disappointment in the 1 minute screen time was immeasurable. There's even a key shot that shows her fighting alongside the Firelights, Echo and Jinx on a hoverboard, totally missing from the show, which I'd have sold my kidney to see. We deserve to see Jinx and Sevika have one final scene before the end of the show. Because we never see her react to Isha's death. We never see her react to Jinx's either. And considering how big their dynamic was in the first 2 acts, it feels odd and unsatisfying to show yet another Zaunite become lonely through the recycled motion of Zaunite deaths. In fact, it's Sevika, Ambessa, Echo and Mel who end up worse than they started and incredibly lonely, which isn't a great look towards their treatment of black characters, or at least their conclusions. And yes, it's hinted that Sevika is biracial given her twist hairstyle in the official concept art, and her voice actress Amira Van being Afro-Latina. The lack of real conclusion to Piltover and Zaun's political situation discouraged many fans. Sevika ends up on the council as the only Zaunite after Caitlyn gives away the Kiraman seat to her, which is at least a start in seeing Caitlyn's true self returning, though her not facing legal repercussions reinforces that wealthy Piltovans are exempt from such, even still. The issue with this resolution is Sevika stands alone against her oppressors, and Zaun is still not independent. She ends up with less than what Silco was offered at the end of Season 1, even though Zaunites put their lives on the line for Piltover. The councillors show no sign of welcoming. They don't agree with her appointed role, already showing bias that will undoubtedly get her outvoted constantly, if not patronised. The council before, which included Jace and Mel, arguably a better set of people, voted out Heimerdinger. What's stopping this newer council from doing the same to Sevika? What are their plans for the distribution of wealth? To undo the years of systemic exploitation? For Zaun's emancipation? Piltovans won't care whilst they still hold more power and control. For a show whose synopsis is, amid the stark discord of twin cities Piltover and Zaun, 2 sisters fight on rival sides of a war between magic technologies and clashing convictions, They fail in concluding a story wherein the premise centered on rebellion against oppression by focusing on magic instead. Yes, it's called Arcane, but the show's themes in Season 1 that fans loved and grabbed the attention of many were wildly different in Season 2. As of this, characters like Sevika, who show a firm principle of allegiance to Zaun and liberation, have to suffice with a neutral ending. I love Sevika, I love what she represents, and that I never questioned where her loyalties lied. It's just unfortunate her character concluded in a way that made her and other Zaunites' efforts feel meritless. Hey guys, thanks for watching to the end. As always, want to give a massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon for helping support me during this slightly long-ish time into making this video. This is actually the longest video on the channel. It was a lot of fun to work on because whilst obviously I've been a bit more maybe critical of Arcane in this video, I did actually still really enjoy Season 2. Obviously it had its faults, but I still really enjoyed it, and I do want to make a disclaimer, there's probably not one character I hate in the show. Maybe minus Sallow and maybe Heimerdinger. And then obviously the average characters you're not really meant to like. I do genuinely love pretty much every single character from Mel, Sevika, Vi, Jinx, Caitlyn. I did like Caitlyn. Pretty much like all of the cast I do like. But I hope to think that this video I kind of took a step back and looked at things kind of, I can't really say unbiased, but as much as of an unbiased opinion that I could in looking at the Piltover versus Zaun conflict, even though it's not a conflict. You know, there are probably points that I've made about a certain character, maybe like Vi, that I didn't extend upon because it's not Vi's video. Please bear that in mind in the comments because I do really love Vi, but there are certain points for literally every character who they've done something wrong. Except Echo. I think Echo's the only character, along with Isha, who did no wrong. And if you did fancy supporting me and the channel, I do have a Patreon and the link is in the description if you want to help out a little bit. Other than that, I will catch you guys in the next video.